shared with Canadians our new and ambitious plan to solve the housing crisis and to help ensure that Canadians, especially younger Canadians, are able to afford their rent or mortgage payments.
Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland has tabled her fourth budget as Canada's Finance Minister. The budget, tabled earlier this week in the House of Commons, features big spending on key issues for the government, including housing and addressing the cost of living. To talk about the budget and where it fell short, I'm excited to be joined back on the show by Kitchener Centre MP Mike Morrice. Here's our conversation now. And Kitchener Centre MP Mike Morrice joins me now. MP Morrice, thanks so much for joining me today.
Good to be back with you again. Thanks for reaching out.
So just to start off, I'm curious to get your overall thoughts of the budget. There's been a lot of thoughts online, but I'm curious to hear what the Green perspective is on the budget.
Yeah, I guess in short, there's some positives to be found in it, but on the whole, it just seems filled with half measures that don't really meet the moment that we're in. And so it almost seems like they're looking to tick boxes for whether it's in the supply confidence agreement or whether it's some kind of political calculus on their part, as opposed to actually addressing the significant challenges that folks across the country are facing. And so that's where I guess I'm disappointed to not see them go further to recognize whether it's on housing or poverty for folks with disabilities. We can go on a long list if you'd like, but time and again, it seems to be the case that they haven't really stepped up to address the crises we're facing sufficiently.
Let's jump to housing first, because there is a lot of investment in housing, a lot. And most of it was pre-announced before the budget. But overall, what do you think about the government's housing proposals in budget 2024?
Well, I guess on the bright side, they at least recognize that we're in a crisis now. So, this time last year, when it came to the last housing minister, we all were having to try to make the case to them that this was a crisis. So they at least have admitted that we're in a crisis. They've got some of the goals right in terms of, building 3.9 million homes by 2031. But when it comes to the measures, I don't think they've appropriately recognized how far behind we are and what is required to actually meet the affordability challenges that folks like yourself, like when you're looking to rent in a certain number of years' time, that's who they should be thinking about. The fact is, it's been 30 years now, right? 30 years of provincial and federal governments pulling out of investing in housing the way the federal government used to after the Second World War and right through the 70s. 40% of all federal housing starts had federal assistance attached in the 1970s. Back in the 80s, in our community, we saw housing co-ops getting built, for example. I lived at Brighton Yards, Uptown Waterloo. You look around downtown Kitchener, from Bread and Roses to Asgard Green, those got built because of federal assistance year over year. And the fact is that as of the mid-90s, all of that funding was pulled back. And so what we need to see this government do is get back into investing at the rates they used to. As of today, Canada is in the bottom of the G7 when it comes to the stock of deeply affordable social housing. Even if we were to double social housing, which this budget doesn't plan on doing, we'd still be middle of the pack. And so I'd like to understand better if you feel there are sufficient measures here. To my view, there's a lot of loans for developers. There's some one-off investments in co-op housing, which they promised 2 years ago, and it looks like they might finally get around to doing. They're re-announcing that the Rapid Housing Initiative, for example, is going to reopen again. But last year there was nothing for rapid housing, for example. We can't have them pretend that 1 year you can invest in housing and the next you take a year off. We need to see ongoing, permanent, sustained, significant investments in building and investing in nonprofits to get built the housing that we need to address the crisis we're facing.
Let's jump to the disability benefit for a minute, because when I spoke with you last, it was making its way through Parliament, and there was a lot of optimism about it. There was a lot of excitement around the benefit. It's been funded now, and the funding is a little underwhelming, I would say, for a lot of advocates for the benefit. Would you agree with that assessment?
That would be probably one of the nicest ways you could possibly put it. I could read you quotes from Twitter from folks living with disabilities who've used words I probably shouldn't use on this podcast to describe how deeply and profoundly disappointed folks are. This is a maximum being proposed of $200 a month. This was a promise that the Liberal Party made in the last election campaign. They are now the governing party. They promised to, in their words, reduce poverty for people with disabilities across the country. And that's not what we're seeing realized here. We're seeing, again, like I said, the maximum of 200. We're also seeing them use the disability tax credit, an incredibly burdensome tax credit that has a very difficult application process to access. I actually was successful in getting an amendment through at committee for the bill that requires the benefit to be barrier-free. I've yet to get answers from this government on how they're going to put forward that the disability tax credit is barrier-free. They've also said they're not going to actually fund it and get it out the door until July of 2025. So none of this is the urgency that the disability community has been calling for, and it certainly doesn't meet the promise they made in the 2021 campaign and in the time leading up to that.
Are there other solutions to getting maybe interim supports to Canadians with disabilities that you've started thinking about or that you've started learning about since the budget came out, or that you've been thinking about before? Is there any other thing that you would advise the government to do besides raise the benefit significantly?
Yeah, it's both. The disability community has actually been calling for a disability emergency response benefit, or DERB for short, modeled after the CERB in the pandemic, in part because the government showed in the pandemic that when governments see crises, it's possible for them to move quickly, and they did so in the pandemic. If they were honest about recognizing the crisis that folks living with disabilities are facing, and let's be clear, 40% of people living in poverty are people with disabilities. At a time when we could move quickly, we could move to put in place a disability emergency response benefit. This government's choosing not to. What we've also put forward, though, is part of what is problematic about the budget is it doesn't actually go to address the ways that we need to generate revenue to afford to do some of these things. When it comes to ensuring that some of the wealthiest Canadians and largest corporations pay their fair share, we've been putting in place a windfall profit tax on oil and gas, putting forward ending the $18 billion in subsidies to the oil and gas industry. We're going to need to see the federal government look at some of those measures in order to then follow through on, as I just said, urgently funding DERB.
All right, Mike Morrice, thanks so much for joining us from Parliament Hill today.
Thanks for having me back on again. Really good to chat with you again.
And that's it for this episode of Political Debrief. Thank you so much for listening. It's great to be back. As always, I would invite you to subscribe to Political Debrief on all of our channels using YouTube and Apple Podcasts. Finally, I would ask you to follow me on Twitter at Josh Olivero to stay updated with the show and other updates from me as they come. That's all from me for now. See you next time.